Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Calgary-Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think everyone here is old enough to remember the year 2015. That was the year that the Harper government brought the budget back into balance after successfully steering Canada through the Great Recession, and when the New York Times congratulated Canada for having the world's most prosperous middle class. This was a few years after the Liberals tried to topple the government because Harper's government refused to run larger deficits than were necessary to steer Canada through the 08-09 financial crash. They had run a disciplined government, one focused on core government services and responsibilities. That same year, the Liberals alone campaigned on a promise to run what they called modest deficits for 3 years that would fund unprecedented generational investments that would boost productivity and allow the budget to balance itself. That was the year that the Liberals destroyed the consensus that successive Liberal and Conservatives shared, that deficits matter, that debt matters, that fiscal discipline matters, that productivity matters, and that all of these things directly impact everyday Canadians and their struggles to make ends meet. So here we are, 10 years later, no historic transformational public investments occurred. During that time, the budget was never balanced, and the national debt doubled. The amount spent on Liberal consultants ballooned out of control despite the federal public service increasing by 100,000 employees, while service levels for Canadians declined. The armed forces still have rusting ships, 40-year-old fighter jets, only a few dozen operational tanks, crumbling barracks and housing. The CRA still can't answer the phone or give accurate information to Canadians. And now 10 years after the Liberals promised transformational, generational public expenditure to boost productivity and delivering the lowest per capita growth in the G7 and the OECD, they've tabled a budget promising the same broken promises recycled from 2015. Mr. Speaker, let there be no misunderstanding. This is a credit card budget. They've tabled a budget, the first in nearly 2 years, that sets a new non-pandemic record of $78 billion in deficit expenditure. That's double the size of the deficit that triggered the resignation of the member from University Rosedale when she was the finance minister. Remember that, Mr. Speaker? Remember the chaos this time last year and the consternation and hand-wringing over Trudeau's $42 billion deficit. Remember the 2025 election, Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister promised Canadians that he was the guy who was going to rein in public spending. This deficit in this budget is the equivalent of adding $5,300 of new debt to every Canadian in every Canadian family. And I will point out, I do intend to split my time with the member for Hamilton East Stony Creek. So what do Canadians get for this staggering new debt that every Canadian knows they have to pay off with interest? Is there any new money in this budget to pay for this so-called generational investments that this government keeps talking about? And the answer is no. This act that we're debating does not contain money for transformational new productivity improving spending. It simply grows the size of government. They keep saying that they are going to reduce spending on the operations of government in order to spend more on capital projects. This budget says these words, but this act does not do these things. The main way with which this government plans to fulfill its unbelievable claims about its investments is through accounting trickery, Mr. Speaker. Some might say, well, what's wrong with that if it helps Canadians differentiate between the administration of government and capital cost? Well, what's wrong, Mr. Speaker, is that their definition is grossly misleading. It is overly expansive, says the PBO. What's wrong with it is that they are deliberately trying to trick Canadians into thinking that this government is building infrastructure when they're actually hiring bureaucrats or connected insiders with consulting contracts or dispensing corporate welfare and calling it capital investment. What's wrong is that they are not following internationally recognized definitions. What's wrong is that this government that has done so much over the last 10 years to compromise its fiscal credibility is now resorting to accounting trickery to try and fool Canadians and the finance community. 10 years ago, Mr. Speaker, the budget was balanced, Homes were relatively affordable in Canada, outside of Vancouver at least. Canada's middle class was doing all right, much better than in its peer countries. And over the last 10 years, though, Canada alone, among G7 countries, and alone among members of the OECD, with the exception of Luxembourg, has had no increase in per capita GDP. None. That means that in Canada, we have been left behind by our peer countries. The value of everything produced in Canada, divided by all of the people in Canada, is now the same as it was 10 years ago. But during that time, the cost of food has gone up, the cost of housing has doubled, the cost of rent has doubled, the cost of living has shot up while Canadians' productivity has not. And the Bank of Canada told the Finance Committee earlier this month, the productivity crisis and the cost of living crisis are the same thing, Mr. Speaker. Canadians increasingly can't afford to live because the government keeps growing, choking out consumers, absorbing more taxes, while creating laws that chase investment out of Canada, leaving workers less productive than in the rest of the developed world. The government spent 10 years passing anti-business laws that have left Canadians with fewer and fewer jobs in Canada's most productive industries. One full year ago, Mr. Speaker, before the tariff war, the senior deputy governor of the Bank of Canada called this a break glass emergency. She talked about how excessive regulation drives out investment from Canada's #1 industry, which is the energy industry. Energy is by far Canada's biggest and most valuable export. And this government spent 10 years trying to regulate it into the ground. There is nothing in this bill that will deal with the root cause of Canada's productivity emergency. There's a lot of talk about major projects, but when they talk about major projects, this government acts like it's having an out-of-body experience and has no idea who has been in charge of the government for the last 10 years and who introduced Bill C-69 and Bill C-48 and the carbon tax and the emission cap and a host of other major and minor acts that have chased $606 billion out of Canada to the United States even before Trump was inaugurated. So, Mr. Speaker, for a moment, let's set aside this government's mismanagement of the Canadian economy, the fiscal deterioration of the national balance sheet that it is presiding over, and the cost of living crisis that has been triggered by this government's overspending, and let's talk about fiscal anchors. On a boat, Mr. Speaker, an anchor is something that you use to hold the boat in place. If you cut the line that connects you from the anchor, your boat drifts aimlessly until it runs aground somewhere. If this government was a sailor, Mr. Speaker, it would be the kind of sailor who brings a new anchor on board the boat, a shiny new piece of equipment that it shows off to everybody, and then throws the anchor overboard without attaching it to a line that connects it to the boat. And that's exactly what this government does, and it wonders why they're adrift. Fiscal anchors mean nothing, Mr. Speaker, if they are not attached to anything. This government was literally only a few weeks old in 2015 when it broke its promise of a limited deficit. They pretended that it never made any such promise and replaced it, their 2015 election promise, with this so-called fiscal anchor of the time, which was that Canada's debt to GDP ratio would never go down. They said it hundreds of times in this chamber. At the end of 2019, they cut that anchor and brought in a new one and said that our new anchor is our AAA credit rating. Well, then Fitch Credit Rating Agency downgraded Canada to AA+. And in the COVID recovery, then they came up with a guardrail, which was a maximum deficit. They blew through that and then went back to claiming that a declining debt to GDP ratio was their fiscal anchor. Well, this budget cuts loose all of their past fiscal anchors and brings in two new ones: a balanced operating spending with revenue by 28-29 and maintaining a declining deficit to GDP ratio. So how much credibility does this government deserve when its history of cutting the line on its anchors? Based on history alone, I say none, but the parliamentary budget officer did give them a 7.5% chance of maintaining the anchor on declining deficit to GDP ratio. So that's getting down close to 20-1, Mr. Speaker, if the PBO is getting betting odds on this government keeping this anchor. So these anchors mean nothing when their operating budget relies on accounting trickery as well. So, Mr. Speaker, This budget adds $80 billion to the national debt at a time when interest is choking out all of other expenses. It's unsustainable, unsupportable, and this government is unbelievable.
Questions and comments. Question and commentary. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's unbelievable is the attitudes in which the Conservative Party has at not wanting to invest in Canadians and indeed in Canada. Quite frankly, and the member just made reference in his speech to D&D, military spending. Does he not realize that the leader of the Conservative Party today sat around a caucus where it was 1% of the GDP? This budget has 2%. How dare he have any gumption at all to be critical in terms of this Prime Minister? My question to the member opposite is, we have a Prime Minister that is traveling the world in order to solidify markets for Canadians, for businesses. In fact, over at the United Emirates, we're talking about hundreds of millions of potential investments for mega projects. Does the Conservative Party support expanding our economy beyond the USA borders?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Crowfoot.
Of course I support that objective, Mr. Speaker. The problem is this government has no credibility on executing on any of the things that it promises. This government, right now, they've been in charge for 10 years, and we've got no significant upgrades on military equipment. The Prime Minister travels all over the world. Every time he goes somewhere, a week or two later, we have the country that he's been to imposing a new tariff. There is no credibility and no execution and no follow-through from this government.
Question and commentary.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Gaspésie, les Îles de la Madeleine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share some points with my colleague, the lack of discipline by the government in its presentation of this budget. There's creative accounting, and they're being told once and again that the way they're presenting things doesn't hold water. A question for my colleague on the budgetary discipline. The deficit is important, $78 billion. We also denounce it. When we talk about disciplined management of public funds, should the government not have cut subsidies to the oil industry? It's about $10 billion per year given to an industry that pollutes, that contributes to accelerating global warming, but that's very profitable and absolutely doesn't need public money.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Crowfoot.
Well, I mentioned the energy industry, and I support that industry as an economic driver of this country, and I'm appalled by the approach of this government to the industry. This government's approach has been to regulate it into the ground, and all the energy industry needs is for the government to get off its back and allow private investment to return to that industry, to employ Canadians in the highest paying jobs, in the most most productive jobs that the Canadian economy offers.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Newmarket, Aurora.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his speech. I do have a question on the credibility, of course, of the budget and the Prime Minister, which is what the Liberals like to talk about. But of course, now we see that there is a $100 billion procurement of submarines that the Prime Minister and the Liberal government forgot to include in the budget. What does that do to credibility? And we have heard now, of course, as well, from the Parliamentary Budget Officer talking about a 7.5% chance of this government actually keeping their promises of their fiscal anchors that they have now invented, and after abandoning the fiscal anchors that have governed our country for the last 30 years. Can the member please comment on that?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Crowfoot.
Yeah, the Parliamentary Budget Officer spared nothing on this, and pointing out just how terrible and how low the credibility of this government. It's like a 92.5% chance that they are not going to sustain their anchor. So their anchors mean nothing. They have no credibility. She's absolutely right. The member, including a moment ago, the member for Winnipeg North, they talk about and claim that these budgets contain these generational expenditures on things like military procurement, and yet it's not in the budget. They talk about procuring submarines without doing so. You know, I don't even have time to get into the debacles of procurement under this government for the armed forces. But I mean, the barracks are crumbling. There's only a handful of tanks. We don't produce enough munitions. We don't produce enough of any of the things we need, and the procurement is just a disaster.